It's Dr. Antonelli, and we are here for our Intro to Psychology audio voiceover for Chapter 11 of our text this semester. This chapter in particular deals with motivation and specific behaviors that have a motivation background. So what we're going to be covering are some theories of motivation as well as things related to work motivation, and then the chapter goes into two more sections, one on hunger motivation, things that motivate our hunger, and sexual motivation as well, and some of the background information on that. Okay, so let's start by talking about some views of motivation. Motivation is one of those concepts that's very difficult to define, very similar to what we talked about in the last chapter, in chapter 9, when we talked about intelligence, and we said that intelligence was very difficult to define as well. So instead of, this is an okay definition, what's on the slide here. However, I almost like to put it in simpler terms, and I like the definition of motivation that states what makes you seek something more at one time than another, as the definition of motivation. Okay, so what makes you seek something more at one time than another. There's tons of variations in motivated behaviors from one time to the next time, or from one situation that you are in to another situation, and from individual person to person. Okay, motivated behaviors really persist until the person actually reaches their goal. Okay, so they would have to, they continue on their path until their goal is reached when they set a goal. Okay, all right, so let's take a look at the three views of motivation. Okay, there are kind of a way to look at these in that the drive theories of motivation, which really took place between the 1940s into the 1950s, is where there's something that's bothering us, almost like an irritation. And this continues until we find a way that we can reduce that irritation, that we can get something to stop being an irritation to us. So the ultimate goal in a drive theory is for us to have nothing to do, because there's something that's bugging us and we want to have that not exist anymore. So a good example is if we have a splinter in our finger, we will continue to find ways to remove that splinter until it's gone or stops bothering us. Okay, so that's a kind of a pretty simple example for what the idea behind a drive theory is. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily tell us some specific particular action that we're going to take. It's just we do things to try to reduce the irritations that we're having about something. Okay, the weakness to drive theory is that it kind of implies that we always want to reduce being stimulated by something, never to kind of increase our stimulation. And it also overlooks what we call external stimuli, which is something from the outside that can push us to a different kind of behavior. Okay, so it really overlooks that those kinds of stimuli exist because we know they do exist, yet this theory does not actually address that or look at that as a factor in it. Okay, a second theory is called homeostasis plus anticipation, meaning homeostasis is where we want to maintain some variable, okay, such as our body temperature, kind of within a set range, where we want to have this state of equilibrium. If you think back to when we discussed Piaget, it's like this kind of state of evenness, nothing's going on either, in either stimulating us or not stimulating us. It's we're just there. It's this state of equilibrium. We want to, maintain a certain body weight. We want to have a certain amount of water in our body. We want to be at this homeostatic state in a way. It also involves anticipating what future needs there are. So if we're in a situation where we know something's coming, we kind of prep ourselves for it in anticipation of it happening. Okay, so the basic position here in the second column talks about maintaining certain body states at what we say is an optimum level, optimum being this kind of middle of the road intermediate level. And we also, what motivates us is to react to what we think could happen, a future need, such as, and I'll give you an example, you eat a larger breakfast one day when you know that you can't have lunch, for example. Okay, so you're anticipating that you will be hungry if you are unable to have lunch that day, so you just eat a little more at breakfast. All right. The major weakness of homeostasis as a theory is that it also overlooks the outside or external stimuli that might actually impact our motivation a little bit. Okay, so it's important to kind of look at that as a weakness. All right. Then we have something called incentive theories. Incentive theories are external stimuli, things that are coming at us from the outside that kind of make us interested and attract us, even if we really don't have what we call a biological need for them. So, for example, if someone offers you your favorite dessert, do you eat it? Is the question. If you are not hungry, you may or may not eat it, okay? Because what it's saying is that it's attractive to us. It's an interesting kind of thing, this external stimuli that someone's offering us. Even though we're not hungry, we may actually accept that dessert, okay? Because we have no biological need for it, but it has interested us. It has aroused our interest in it, okay? So the motivation we have is a response basically to our, this attractive stimuli of this dessert that's usually our favorite. And it's going to pull us toward an action of eating the dessert, all right? The problem with this theory is that it's kind of incomplete unless it's combined with either drive or homeostasis, one of the above theories here. It can't really work on its own. Something else related to either the homeostasis theory or drive theory comes into play here. All right. So it's interesting to kind of, look at these views as working with each other in a way, or especially this last one, incentive theory. Okay. Now, this figure has to do with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We almost always have more than one motivation. Sometimes these motivations agree and sometimes they don't, and they're actually in conflict with one another, okay? In order to resolve this conflict, we can use Maslow's theory that you're seeing on your screen now, all right? This is a hierarchy going from the bottom purple section here of physiological needs up to the pinnacle or point here in, I guess it's yellowish orange, self-actualization. So physiological needs include things like food, drink, oxygen. These are basic needs. Then we have safety needs of security and feeling like everything's okay and that we're safe. Those two levels are the basic needs. It's almost like we need these two levels for survival. Okay, and as a result, if these needs are not met, then none of the other needs can happen. Okay, and you can't really move further up here. All right, you have psychological needs of belongingness and feeling loved through social interactions, and then you have esteem needs of feeling a sense of accomplishment and good about yourself, and then you get up to the self-fulfillment needs of achieving your potential and your full potential. Not everyone gets to this top level, but again, it's these lower levels could be in conflict with esteem and belongingness because you can't move up to those until you satisfy the lowest levels first. Okay, so just something to think about there as motivation that's in conflict with other motivations. All right. Goals and deadlines are a huge piece of motivation because it's one of the most powerful ways to motivate anyone by setting a goal. including yourself. You set your own goals. Sometimes people set goals for other people. If they're teachers, let's say, setting goals for their students, parents setting goals for their children. But this is a powerful, powerful way to motivate anyone, is through the use of a goal. The most effective goals are specific, which tells you what to do in a time frame; difficult, which is to inspire work beyond the average or what you can do; and realistic, which means the goal is not beyond your reach, meaning it's so difficult you'll never get to it. That's not what realistic means. You can get to it. All right, and it's something that is not beyond your reach. You can get to it. Other important factors involved with setting a goal is to make this serious commitment. And oftentimes the serious commitment piece is done publicly, like where you would say to someone, okay, here's my goal. You tell someone about it, whether it's a friend, a parent, a teacher, whoever. Okay. You also have to receive feedback on your progress. How are you doing with this goal? How close are you to achieving, what you set out as your goal? How far are you away? If you get constant feedback on that, it's going to make the process and more easier, and basically keep you more motivated, right? And you also have to believe that the goal will bring a fair reward, meaning, is the effort you're putting forth worth it for the reward that you're going to get when you reach that goal? That's the question that, if you have an answer like yes, the reward is going to be worth the effort, then you will continue to be motivated and stick to making that commitment and reaching your goal. All right. Let's look at realistic goals for a second. The thing about realistic goals is that when we set them, we often tend to underestimate how much time that we're going to need to achieve it, and how much effort that we're going to need to achieve it. All right. And the reason why is we just don't maybe think it through exactly to really plan out the time and effort, and most people tend to underestimate what it's going to take them. So the best way to do this when talking to people about goals is to have them plan for more time and resources than what seems necessary. So don't plan for plan for more time, so that when you reach it sooner, it's a better result. All right. And to start as quickly as possible. So allow yourself more time than you think you will actually need, so that when you reach the goal, it's a positive outcome. A good example is that governments actually tend to underestimate how much time they will need for something. They give a great example in the text about the construction of the Sydney Opera House, and how it was expected to be completed in 1963 at the cost of $7 million, whereas it was completed in 1973 at a cost of $102 million. So there's a perfect example, not from an individual person's goal, but a governmental goal that was underestimated by a lot, okay, big time, all right? So keep that in mind, all right? When we talk or continue to talk about goals and deadlines, we have to kind of think about this. There's a value to deadlines. Deadlines tend to motivate people to work harder. Now, some of you may disagree with that. You may be saying, oh, I feel a lot of pressure with a deadline. But without that pressure, sometimes motivation is not there, okay? The deadline really does work better. And setting a deadline for, let's say, parts of an assignment, if it's a pretty big assignment as a student that you have to complete, actually helps by spreading out the task, giving deadlines for this section of the project or the report, and followed by this section. And there was an actual very interesting research study that was done of two classes that one professor was teaching. And one of the classes the professor was teaching had specific deadlines set for a project that they had to complete, okay? And then the second class actually was given the opportunity to choose their deadlines. And within that group, there was two choices given within the class that was allowed to choose their deadlines. One choice within that class was they had to write 3 papers spaced out over the semester. So let's say every 6 weeks, they, they had to choose a deadline, but it had to be spaced out over the 15-week semester, even though they made that choice of how to space it out. And then the other group within that second class was given this, okay, you can space out your papers, or you have to do all three papers can be due at the end. And that second group within that second class was allowed to choose that. All right. The results was that class 1, who had the deadline set, actually did better than class 2, as just one of the results. The other result was that in class 2, those who set their deadlines with 3 papers spaced out did the same as class 1. They did pretty good. And they also did better than those who submitted all 3 at the end. So what it really comes out to from this study was that deadlines have value, even if they're set for someone, or if people are given a choice to set their own deadlines. When people decided to space out the deadline over the 15-week semester, they did better than those that chose to hand everything in at the very end. Okay, because a lot of times what sets in is procrastination, and the second part of this slide talks about procrastination. The word crass, or the section of the word procrastination, that's CRAS in the middle here, that's a Latin phrase meaning tomorrow. That's why you get the word procrastination, means putting something off until later. And people who get started toward their goals, if they set specific plans, then they often do better, okay, about what they will do, the plan about what they will do, when they will do it, where they will do it. If they get started toward their goals, they often have an increased chance of completing it, okay? So when we estimate the probability of doing something, it increases our chances of actually doing it, okay? This actual term is known as the mere measurement effect. Okay, so the mere idea that we've, estimated what, it's going to take, the probability of us doing something is going to actually increase the probability of us actually doing it. Okay, that's what that actually means. Making any kind of decision, saying, yes, I think I want to do this, or yes, I'm going to set a goal, and then I set that goal. Making any sort of decision helps to end kind of this cycle of procrastination. Okay, once you make a decision then and start a process in any way, then you've overcome procrastination, and most likely it ends and you're actually able to move on. All right. Conflict between doing work now and procrastinating until later is an example of what we call temptation. Okay. This term or phrase called delay of gratification is where we decline something pleasant now, an activity that's pleasant for us now, in order to get kind of more pleasure out of it later, let's say. Okay? And there's a couple of things about delaying gratification that's interesting. When we talk about advancing or moving from childhood to adulthood, we gradually improve our ability to resist temptation and to delay gratification. There is a great study, a little experiment that was done called the marshmallow experiment. I'm sure some of you have seen this experiment on YouTube or in other classes, where they have 2 very young children who they put one marshmallow in front of, and they say to the children, if you can wait till I come back in the room, the researcher's going to leave the room, and not eat that marshmallow, then I will give you a second marshmallow. Or you can choose to eat the marshmallow now and not get a second marshmallow. Okay? So that that kind of implies to the children that, if I wait, I'm going to have an advantage later because I'll be able to get a second marshmallow. Some of the children are able to resist that temptation and delay their gratification. Okay? Most people overestimate their ability to resist temptation. And again, they don't realize, their thought process when it comes to temptation. All right. It's better to avoid any sort of tempting situations than to actually combat temptation that's right in front of you. So you almost want to take yourself out of something that could be tempting before you even get to it. Because once the temptation's in front of you, it's more difficult to try to combat it at that point. Okay. Resisting a temptation helps people to later resist the same type of temptation, even though we're not sure exactly why that happens. But it often also weakens a person's ability to resist the other types. Okay, so it's almost like a one-to-one correspondence. All right, if you resist a certain temptation, you can resist it again at some point, but it has to be of the same, the exact same temptation. If it's a different one, you're often weaker in resisting the different one. That's an interesting piece. Also, think about when we talked about observing other people and their actions, when we talked about behaviorism, all right? Seeing another person yield to a temptation increases the risk of you yielding, okay? Unless the person that is yielding that you're watching is an outsider, someone who doesn't not necessarily related. We're not talking about relations, but we're talking about someone who you see as different from yourself. If you see someone as different from yourself, then you can resist the temptation. However, if it's someone you don't like or someone you don't want to be associated with, then you actually can resist that temptation. All right. And then when we talk about ethical norms, there was a section that talked about cheating. All right. And when someone is reminded of, okay, well, with the test, you're not supposed to use your textbook if it's, a test that someone can do at home, a student can do at home, just a reminder of that, ethical part of don't use your book, don't do the test with someone else, don't share your answers. That's going to decrease the cheating temptation in some situations, not all, but in some. Okay. So interesting piece there. The question about how does motivation actually play a role in how hard people work, how effectively they work, and then how satisfied they are in relationship to their work or jobs. All right. There are two approaches to job design to think about. All right. There's the scientific management approach. They also call this Theory X. It's very, very straightforward, where the boss makes all the decisions. And as a result, it's the view that, most of the employees are actually indifferent, they're lazy, they're uncreative, and the jobs that they're doing are very simple and foolproof. It's pretty much like, here it is, do the job. Here it is, do the job. Not much thinking involved, not much creativity involved, very straightforward. The boss says, here's what we're doing, and the boss is the one that makes the decisions. The second approach to job design is known as the human relations approach. This is known as Theory Y. And this is where there's a little bit more of responsibility and meaningful tasks that are the employees are a part of. So the boss may still give these tasks to the employees, but the tasks are more meaningful than they are in the scientific management approach, and the employee kind of assumes some more responsibility. They like variety in what they're doing. They have a sense of accomplishment and a sense of responsibility. There's many advantages and greater job satisfaction in the human relations approach, but the disadvantages to the human relations approach is that it takes longer to actually train workers in this approach because there's a bit more involvement of the tasks that are needed and you have to train the workers for that. And as a result, because there's kind of more expected and they're given more responsibility, the workers expect to be paid more. Okay, so this idea about more general job satisfaction in the human relations approach, it's a good one. It definitely is a good one. All right, and there are some additional ideas about job satisfaction. It's strongly, you might want to circle this word in your PowerPoint, it's strongly correlated with how much interest you have in your job, but only moderately correlated with how good of a performance you do with that job. So the interest seems to be more related to job satisfaction than the performance that you have on the job. All right. People who are generally happy, they have this disposition about them that they're happy. They're more likely to be satisfied with their jobs. And then older workers are also generally likely to be more satisfied with their jobs. Okay, why is that, do you think, that older workers tend to be more satisfied with their jobs? Well, They often tend to have better, higher paying jobs, right? Because they've been in the workforce longer. And younger people are tend to be harder to satisfy when they start off in their careers. They're still trying to find, what their little, specialty is and all that kind of stuff. So it's important to remember that, right? Pay and job satisfaction. Of course, job satisfaction requires this perception that the pay scale is fair and proportional, okay, to the qualifications that are required of the individual who holds that job. All right, the pay kind of increases the quantity of the output, meaning how much a person does, and the outcomes and what they're producing. Let's say is as the pay increases the quantity, but there's the less on quality. The quality of the output doesn't necessarily increase when pay increases, all right? Quality of someone's job and what they're doing and the output they're coming out with actually depends more on their intrinsic motivation. Their inner feeling about their job increases the quality of their work, okay? When work, when the work stress gets so bad, someone could experience job burnout. If they're not satisfied and they're very stressed at work, well, work stress could result in job burnout. Job burnout is a long lasting, this is important, it's a long lasting sense of mental and physical exhaustion and discouragement. This is where someone feels detached from their job and their coworkers, and they lack any sense of accomplishment. It isn't, if your stress is not fixed, or it kind of doesn't go away after, let's say, a pleasant vacation that you have, then it could be considered job burnout. All right, there has to be that sense of it's this long lasting thing. All right, it's not something where, okay, if you're now, on a vacation for a week, you come back to your job and things are much better and you're not feeling that stress, then it's probably not job burnout. Okay. Certain professions are more hard hit when it comes to job burnout, and those are the helping professions, such as nurses and teachers. In addition, people who are prone to depression are also prone to burnout. All right. It's less likely for someone to experience burnout if they're happy with their home life, they have enjoyable leisure activities, and they have a high physical activity. Those are the people who are less, tend to be less affected by burnout. All right. Your motivation to work actually depends on your organization's leadership. All right. And there's some characteristics of a good leader that the person in command and who's the leader has this combination of their personality, intelligence, expertise, their values and motives, and how they handle people. All right. The combination of these things is what makes a good leader. However, what constitutes good leadership, besides the leader having these skills and these traits, is that it really does depend on the situation. Sometimes a certain leadership style works in one situation but does not necessarily work in another situation. So again, good leadership really does depend on the situation, and then knowing that as the leader you may have to adjust your style. Okay, there's two kinds of leaders. A transformational leader is someone who articulates a vision of the future. They stimulate their subordinates intellectually, asking questions, having them solve problems. You motivate them to use their creativity, their imagination to kind of make the organization or the company move forward. This is more of a form of shared leadership, because a lot of responsibility is, falls on the employees to come up with ideas and, to be a part of the team. Okay. A transactional leader is someone who tries to make an organization be more efficient at what they're doing, and things that they are already doing, not to come up necessarily with all new ideas, but to already use what they're doing and then provide rewards, usually in the form of money, pay, for effective work with the things they're already doing. So the difference, transformational, they're looking for new, creative, unique ideas to move the organization forward. Transactional leader is someone who asks or wants the employees to kind of go with the ideas and things that they're already doing well in the organization, but let's try to give them rewards for making the organization more efficient at what we are already doing. Okay, so we've talked now about motivational theories. We've talked about how those relate to job or work motivation and satisfaction and burnout. And now the second part of this chapter deals with hunger motivation. So let's talk about some of this. All right. Um, Hunger motivation, and then the third section we're going to talk about sexual motivation, really are the physiological aspects of motivation. So you have to say to yourself, what's the purpose of hunger? What's the purpose of hunger? Well, hunger basically is to keep fuel, because we get fuel from food, right, available for our body to use. All right. So there's a short term regulation where, the main factor for when we stop eating is our stomach and our intestines are full or distended or bloated a bit. Okay. So and these areas, the stomach and the intestines, are part of the digestive system. So when that's full, on the short term basis after eating a meal, then we know that, okay, we've satisfied our hunger. Okay. If our stomach is empty, we tend to, hunger is stimulated because there's a hormone called ghrelin, Grelin, and that's one way that our hunger is stimulated. But there's also a second way, which is a drop in our glucose levels that are entering our cells. Okay. Glucose is an important sugar. This is why this is all the physiological aspects, and it's an important source of energy for the body and the main energy source for the brain. So it's really important. And if so, we're low on glucose, that's when our hunger is stimulated a bit. Okay, and insulin is a hormone that helps to increase the flow of glucose and other, of course, nutrients into body cells, and we need that in our cells because it also then stimulates neurons in our brain, which will then say, hey, on a short term basis, I'm satisfied now, I can stop eating. All right. In addition to short term regulating, of hunger, there's a long term regulation. And if there's kind of mistakes or errors where we over or under eat in the short term, going back to this slide, then we need some of these things in the long term regulation of hunger to correct the short-term errors of either overeating, eating too much, or undereating, not eating enough. Okay, a set point will help us do that because we set an average or a mean or average weight without fluctuating. So this is something that's a variable that our body works to kind of maintain and keep that average weight. All right, we'll see slight fluctuations, of course, very slight, but from day to day. However, for the most part, our average weight stays the same because we have this set point that we want to be at in the long term regulation of hunger. In addition, we have a hormone called leptin, and this hormone helps the body maintain this constant weight because it sends messages to our brain to stop eating, to our cells, oh, okay, I have enough fat in them, so I should eat less. Okay. It's one of those messaging hormones. So you got to think about it that way. All right. This figure, 11.8, is the figure of the brain. And quite simply, what you really need to know is this area called the hypothalamus. It's located on the underside of the brain here, and it helps to regulate some of these motivational behaviors of eating, drinking, sexual behavior, and other motivated activities. All right. If there's any damage to the hypothalamus, then we could have impairments regulating our eating. So it's an important kind of brain piece to know since we've talked about the brain multiple times in this class. Okay. Besides the physiological influences on eating and hunger that we just talked about with the brain, the set point, the leptin, the hormones, the glucose, all of those physiological parts, there are also social and cultural influences that we always need to think about. Okay. A couple of these just bullet points here are very interesting and things you probably already know when you think about it. But people eat more in groups when they're eating alone. And the reason is that you tend to linger more because you are in a group eating together. Okay, meaning you'll stay longer. So the longer you stay somewhere, hang out at the table, the more you tend to eat. Okay, and for example, if someone in the group is having dessert, you almost feel a need to have dessert, even if you're not hungry on a physiological level. Okay. People tend to eat more and drink more and enjoy their meal when they have higher expectations for something, higher expectations for how good, let's say, the food is going to taste, or everyone was looking forward to having a certain food, or other things like the name of a food. Okay, if the name of a food sounds like an interesting one, we'll tend to, have this higher expectation of, oh, this sounds like a really good meal. In the text, they give you some really interesting examples of foods that had one name, which was not very nice to hear, like it just didn't sound nice, and then it was renamed, and people ate more of it after it was renamed. For example, there was a food called, it was a fish, and it was called the slime head, and then they decided to rename that to called it the orange roughy. So it was like, okay, would you eat a dish of slime heads, or would you eat a dish of orange roughy? It almost just gives that expectation. It just changes your expectation of it. Or the supposed location of things. Okay, so for example, a restaurant was offering a free glass of wine to anyone who had a meal there, who ordered a meal. And one of the choices of the wines came from California, and one of the choices of the wines came from North Dakota. Okay. And the expectation was that, oh, I'm going to obviously have the wine from California because California is known for their wineries. So that was an interesting thing because it's all about where this particular food or drink came from. All right. In addition, another social and cultural influences, people tend to eat more when they're offered larger portions. They feel obligated to finish it. All right. So this is the whole current trend towards supersizing things that we've been experiencing at fast food restaurants and other restaurants, the whole idea of supersizing. Okay. So overeating has actually become a problem because of the combined influence of genetics within each individual and the environment. Okay. And sometimes this overeating can lead to obesity. Quite simply, obesity is excessive accumulation of body fat. They look at the body mass index of an individual without actually, you don't have to do any formulas here, but they kind of divide the weight in kilograms by the height in meters and square it. And then they have this chart here that anyone with a BMI or body mass index over 25 is overweight. Over 30, they're obese. And over 40, they're extremely obese. So it's interesting, when people get on a scale for a doctor's visit, it would be more important, not so much the weight, but the BMI, okay, to know what that number is, all right? There's a limited role of emotional disturbances in obesity. It plays a slight role. It's not everything can we relate to an emotional disturbance, like reacting to emotions and emotional distress by overeating. That plays a role in it, a part. It's not everything though. When people feel good, they tend to eat less, and when people binge eat, they tend to do that as a response to a stressful situation. Oftentimes, when they're actually trying to diet, they tend to binge because a stressful situation has kind of set them off. Okay, so again, there is a bit of emotions involved with overeating. In addition, we talk about genetics. There's no actual common gene that we can identify as an obesity gene. However, we really focus our discussion a bit more on something called epigenetics, which we talked about in an earlier chapter. And what that means is that there have been changes over time in how our genes are expressed and how they come out. Okay, there's no common gene we can identify though for obesity. All right. Obese people also tend to be inactive and remain so even after losing weight. This is where the energy output piece comes in. If there's low energy expenditure, that's the inactivity piece. That is a good predictor of just weight gain in general in adults. Okay, weight gain in general. All right. In addition, we talk about losing weight, and this is connected to motivation because there is a conflict between the motive to enjoy eating now and the motive to, let's say, feel good about losing weight later. There's that now and later kind of conflict that we talked about. Think about with the marshmallow experiment. Most people tend to in the long term fail to lose weight and keep it off for that reason of this conflict between the motivation now to let's enjoy eating, or to say, okay, well, I'm going to feel really good later about losing weight if I can wait and be patient, similar to the marshmallow experiment. All right. We found that combining diet with exercise works the best, even though success rates are still disappointing in this area, even those who do use a combination of diet and exercise, because there are some successes we hear more about the failures than the successes usually. We often tend to hear about someone who lost weight and then regained it back, or kind of go back and forth. We hear less about kind of success stories, okay, which is why they put this little piece of information on here, okay? When people have a strong motivation to be thin, it could result in something called anorexia nervosa. This is, the word nervosa actually means for reasons of the nerves. This is where someone actually really intensely, this is an important word, okay, intensely fears gaining weight, and so they refuse to basically eat the normal amount that they need to be eating on a daily basis, all right? People suffering from this condition tend to keep themselves from eating, deprive themselves to a dangerous, that's the key word here, a dangerous point, okay? In addition, individuals with this condition tend to show extreme physical activity, all right? They tend to work out a lot or do a lot of physical activity, and the reason that they do this is to actually regulate their temperature, because often they have a low body temperature as a result from being deprived of the food. They tend to kind of account for that and make up for that by doing extreme physical activity to kind of warm up and regulate their temperature, all right? Often most people, and this is research has found this, people with anorexia tend to have no psychiatric problems prior to developing anorexia. People with anorexia tend to have this perfectionist kind of or OCD personality, but those are not necessarily psychiatric problems that existed, before they developed anorexia. All right. Because of this, treating, for depression, someone who has anorexia is really not effective. So we shouldn't be using treatments for depression for someone who has anorexia. It's not effective because they did not have psychiatric problems prior to developing it. Okay. The treatment usually for anorexia is to just have individuals increase their body warmth, but also to avoid excessive exercise, but just to increase their body warmth in other ways. And another good treatment, an effective treatment, is putting the plate of someone who has anorexia nervosa on a scale when they're eating, to encourage them to eat at a pace that and an amount that's not too little and not too much. That has been found to be an effective treatment. Okay. Another eating disorder, in addition to anorexia nervosa, is known as bulimia nervosa. And it's an interesting one as well, because this condition is where people alternate between depriving themselves of eating and as well as excessively eating, which is known as binging. And then they feel a loss of control, okay? Sometimes after they excessively eat, they will purge what they've eaten as well. And what's interesting is that since about 1990, the occurrence of this particular condition has leveled off a bit, and cultural factors, mainly the Western influence of culture, where we have lots of abundant and tasty foods, has contributed to the condition of bulimia nervosa. Okay, so it's interesting to look at this one as compared to anorexia, and most people actually do recover from this fully or partly, but then they have some lingering problems of depression, and then bulimia itself has actually been compared to a drug addiction, because let's think about this. Bulimia has the condition of abstaining from food, then eating large quantities of it, to experience kind of a high, quote unquote. This is very similar to a drug addiction, right? Because you want to experience that high, except that people experiencing bulimia nervosa are more like food addicted, mainly to fats and sugars. Okay, so they abstain, but then they eat larger quantities to get this high feeling, to get this good feeling. Very similar to drug addiction. Okay, all right, the last section of this chapter has to do with sexual motivation. All right, there are similarities to hunger, which we just finished discussing. So let's talk about this. There are two similarities between sexual motivation and hunger. Sexual motivation, just like hunger, really does depend on both the physiological aspect of drive as well as incentives, incentives that are part of motivation. And also, like hunger, someone's sex drive increases during times of being deprived, all right? And people can inhibit or hold back that drive when they actually need to. So those are two similarities between sexual motivation and hunger. There are also two differences, and that is that the difference is that we do not need to be around food to feel hungry. Okay, it's almost like we could be, we don't need to have food there to actually feel hungry, but we often need a partner. We need someone there in order to feel sexual arousal. Okay. In addition, the other difference is that we eat in public. Okay, that's the hunger piece related to hunger, but we have sexual activities in private. Okay, that's the sexual motivation piece. So there's the two differences between sexual motivation and hunger. Okay, there was a person named Alfred Kinsey, and whoops, let me go back. Sorry about that. He was originally an insect biologist. And it all started when he was actually asked to teach the biological portion of a course on marriage. All right. And so, what he decided to do as he was interviewing people, um, you know, was he made them feel at ease. He was very good at interviewing people so that they would kind of speak freely about their experiences. But he was also very good at detecting people who might have been telling lies. Okay, so he did a survey of about 18,000 people who, again, the representation was not exactly there because these 18,000 people were from, let's say, fraternities and nunneries, specifically in the Midwest region of the country. So, again, not representative of the whole population. We've talked about that when we've talked about research. But what he did find overall was that in these surveys and questioning people and doing these interviews, which is what he did, his overall finding was that most people were really unaware of how much sexual behavior varies from one individual to another. Okay, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a movie called Kinsey. There is a movie. It's based on Alfred Kinsey and his work as a researcher doing these interviews. It was a movie from 2004, if you ever want to look it up, starring, I think it was Liam Neeson and Laura Linney. So you might want to look that up. If you have time, watch it. It's a very interesting movie. It's a great movie that actually, it really captures Alfred Kinsey quite well. Okay. The next two slides, without spending too much time on them, actually provide some information on percentages of variations of different sexual behaviors. Okay, and what this figure 11.12 kind of captures is people were asked questions about various sexual activities, and they were asked to rate them on a scale of very appealing to somewhat appealing to not appealing to not at all appealing. Okay, and you could take a look at this chart here and see the different kind of categories go up and down the vertical axis here, and the percentage rating for each act as very appealing. The higher it gets is very appealing, goes along the y-axis down here. Okay, and then of course the red bars are men, and the blue or purple, I can't tell how it looks, those are women. All right, so take a look at the different kinds of categories here and how people have rated them on that chart. And then in this figure, it just gives us again, this is from a researcher in 2010 who did this. percentage of people who've had intercourse within the last month in bloom, within the last year in red. Again, just some information from charts that you might want to take a look at. Okay, you could make some conclusions or some references to motivation based on what you're seeing in those charts. All right. Basically, findings of sexual behaviors and how they are motivated shows lots and lots of variations. These variations are usually by culture as well as cohort. Cohort, remember, having to do with the age of individuals and their genders. Okay, we found there's a considerable amount of variation of sexual customs among different cultures and subcultures. One of these differences comes in with attitudes about premarital sex, and this whole area was kind of, you know, historically uncommon prior to the early 1900s. But remember, since the early 1900s, we've had standards change, obviously, over time. Okay, and so as a result, these various kind of ideas about sexual customs and behaviors have changed with time, over time, historically. In addition, we have lots of other kinds of things that have happened. Puberty is starting at an earlier age now. Okay, it used to be 15 or 16. Now it's at 10 or 12. Marriage, in the earlier part of the century, the 1900s, was at a very young age, whereas now we're talking after age 25 traditionally. There's also a greater acceptance of teenage sex. However, keep in mind that this greater acceptance is comparing it to earlier times. But even though, you know, we see some of this now, there's most individuals still view teenage sex as kind of deviant behavior. All right. There's also greater sexual freedom now as compared to times in the past. All right. So again, just overall comparisons of when times have changed based on cultural change, societal change, and that has an impact. All right. Other considerations that play a role in sexual behavior include the era of AIDS and the AIDS virus, which began in the 1980s. All right. AIDS is known as acquired immune deficiency syndrome. It's a sexually transmitted disease. It attacks the body's immune system. Okay. And it's HIV is the virus that causes AIDS. There are 3 common ways that HIV is transmitted: through blood transfusions where the needle is contaminated, okay, and the blood is contaminated. And then there's the sharing of needles for illegal drug use, all right, and then there's sexual contact with an infected person. Those are the 3 ways that the HIV virus is transmitted, okay. Someone can have the HIV virus and live with it for many, many, many years. We have lots of new therapies to address the virus, and people are now surviving longer than they were many years ago in the 80s when the virus first appeared. Okay, sexual motivation. Remember, this whole chapter is about motivation, and we've talked about theories, we've talked about hunger motivation, we've talked about work motivation, and now we're into sexual motivation. It depends on both physiological and cognitive influences, such as sexual arousal. There are 4 stages. Excitement, which has to do with various physical changes people feel in that process. The plateau, where changes last from kind of varying lengths of time and intensity at certain levels. We have the release of orgasm, and we have a relaxation and decreased anxiety during the resolution stage. All right, so again, just some information to know about the stages, and this connects again to motivation. All right. Sexual development and identity is what we talk about when development in a fetus depends on the hormonal influences of testosterone and estradiol. Testosterone is the hormone that's present in higher quantities in males than females, and estradiol is the hormone present in higher quantities in females than males. Okay. In the early stages of development, the human fetus actually possesses structures anatomically that either will develop into male genitals or female genitals. It really does depend on which one of these hormones is in higher quality to have those anatomical structures develop into male or female genitals. All right. So again, just information related to sexual development. Intersex or intersexes are people that have an anatomy that appears to kind of fall between males and females. They have varying amounts of both hormones, and therefore the development of the genitals is intermediate between male and female. Okay. Acceptance is the key to identity for individuals who are part of this intersex population. Okay. So it's something to keep in mind. People vary in their sexual orientation, just as they do their food preferences and other motivations. All right. Sexual orientation is someone's tendency to respond sexually to male or female partners, to both, or to neither. Okay. This also varies in degrees from exclusively being homosexual, which is responding sexually to someone of your own sexual orientation, and to exclusively heterosexual with kind of intermediate parts as well. All right, so it's just something. This is all background information. All right, sexual orientation differs between men and women in several ways. Two of them are actually given here. Okay, quite simply, nearly all men identify their sexual orientation quite early, and they cannot imagine switching. Whereas women, that's slightly different for. They discover their orientation later, and a fair number of women have a consistent bisexual response, where bisexuality is the attraction to both sexes. All right. Just again, physical attributes that occur when men and women are sexually aroused. A man's sexual interest can be, we can accurately say that having penis erections is a way that we can accurately indicate a man's sexual interest. But for females, for women, we can't use their vaginal secretions as a dependable way to measure their sexual interest. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy between the two and physical actions that we see happening, right? Think back to what we've been talking about all semester with nature versus nurture. This last slide talks about the back to nature kind of idea, where we have this nature or genetic influence on sexual orientation. Genetic influences and prenatal environment affect sexual orientation, but how much effect or how much influence it has, we do not know. Okay, and again, another explanation for these genetic influences is this idea of epigenetics that I mentioned earlier, and that was this activation or inactivation of a certain gene at a certain time. Okay, so the other kind of nature or genetic influence that we're seeing is the structure in the brain of the hypothalamus. Depending on the size, it can contribute to certain aspects of sexual behavior, having, it favor heterosexual versus homosexual orientation. So it's really interesting, but for this last piece, there's only a very tiny study, a small study that's found. It only used a few participants to find this as a conclusion. All right, so we can't necessarily say with 100% certainty and with strong research in this area that we have found information about the size of a structure called the hypothalamus in the brain. Okay, so it's just something to think about. So as a possible influence on sexual orientation from this nature or genetic background. Okay, so keep in mind from this chapter that we were talking about theories of motivation. We talked about the different kinds of motivation, and those were work-related, hunger-related, and a sexual motivation as well. So lots of great information in this chapter. Please read the chapter. We'll discuss a little bit more in class and take some questions at that point. Okay, have a great day, and we'll see everyone in class.